Saturday, September 16, 1882. The New York Times. Flames in oil refineries. Lightning causes a great fire at Newtown Creek. Thousands of barrels of oil burned at the refineries of Sun and Fleming and J. Donald and Company. Other property destroyed. 2 men burned to death. During the heavy thunderstorm of Thursday evening, a sheet of lightning descended from the heavens, apparently divided, and one portion struck an oil tank belonging to Sun and Fleming's Kings County Oil Refinery, situated on Newtown Creek in the 18th Ward, Brooklyn. This was at 9 o'clock. The tank was provided with what are known as safety traps, and these, acting automatically, closed, with but 2 exceptions, and smothered the flames, which burst out as soon as the tank was struck. A few moments later, and before the first fire was extinguished, a second flash struck the large tank of the Locust Hill Refinery, owned by J. Donald and Company of number 124 Maiden Lane. This tank held 30,000 barrels of crude petroleum, and when the lightning struck it, it was badly rent, the oil bursting into flames, lighting up the sky for miles around and filling the air with a dense black smoke. The Brooklyn firemen who had been called out by the first fire, aided by a force called out by a second alarm, under the direction of Acting Chief Engineer Smith, devoted themselves and what little water they could obtain from the pumps and wells nearby to preventing the spread of the flames to the neighboring tanks. In their labors, they were assisted by the steam tug Brilliant, owned by one of the refineries further down the creek, and by the steam tug Stone, owned by DeVoe and Company. The latter boat was useless for a long time, however, as she grounded in the mud some distance from the fire. While a portion of the firemen were engaged in cooling down the red-hot tank and keeping the fire from spreading, another party, helped by workmen who had gathered around, drew off about 15,000 barrels of crude oil into canal boats and lighters lying on the dock. The flames were supposed to be well under control at about 4:30 o'clock yesterday morning, when Chief Smith, Foreman Charles Keegan of truck number 4, and a number of firemen started on a reconnoitering expedition. The burning tank was situated close to a brick wall, and between the two the party passed. At the tank they found a workman at one of the gates, and while trying to learn what he was about, the party heard a hissing noise, and an instant later the tank gave way and a sea of oil and flames started toward the creek. The men ran for their lives, and all escaped except Foreman Keegan, who was supposed to have been blinded by the smoke and flame. He ran in the wrong direction, was caught between the falling tank and the wall, and was burned to death. His body, burned to a crisp and almost unrecognizable, was recovered from the ruins last evening and taken to his home at number 200 South 3rd Street. His companions, with 2 exceptions, made their way across the oil-laden lighters to the Brilliant and were saved. John R. Cooper, foreman of the Locust Hill Oil Works, was badly burned about the hips, and with his clothing on fire, leapt from the dock into the river, breaking one of the small bones of his left leg in the jump. His injuries, the attending surgeon says, although painful, are not of a dangerous character, and he will be able to be about in a few weeks. Captain Stuart Dean, a lighterman, living at number 183 Greenpoint Avenue, Brooklyn, who tried to escape, met with a terrible death. He evidently became bewildered, ran to the creek with his clothing a mass of flames, and leapt into shallow water, where he stuck in the mud. In an instant he was surrounded by a mass of the burning oil, and he was slowly roasted to death. Fireman McCarthy, of steamer number 12, saw the man struggling for life, and at the risk of his own life, rushed to his rescue. He tried to beat off the flames and pull the captain out of the mud, but his attempt failed, and he had to abandon the sufferer to his fate. While this tragedy was being enacted, there was a series of explosions as the flames spread from tank to tank, and finally to the oil-laden vessels. Another fire broke out with renewed vigor. The hawsers holding the 6 lighters and canal boats to the wharf were cut, as well as the lines of hose loading to the fire tug Brilliant. The tide was setting up the creek, and the released boats floated with it up to what is known as the Penny Bridge, an old structure giving access from the 18th Ward to Queens County and Calvary Cemetery. By order of Chief Smith, the draw was thrown open, and that draw is all that remains of the bridge today, the Brooklyn approach being entirely burned away. Settling into the mud, the boats remained near the wreck of the bridge throughout the day yesterday, and the flames raged fiercely until far into the evening, when the hulls had burned to the water's edge. Fearing that the oil from these boats would float down the creek and set fire to the vessels and refineries further down, Chief Smith had a boom of logs and old canal boats swung across the creek, midway between the location of the fire and the works of the Standard Oil Company. This served its purpose and kept back the burning oil, which occasionally floated down a rill of fire on the surface of the creek. The direction of the wind and the fact that oil gives out no sparks alone saved a little settlement of a dozen or more frame houses at the edge of the creek from destruction. While the oil in the Locust Hill tanks and in the boats was exploding, one of the largest tanks in the yards of the Greenpoint Refining Works, owned by Wilson and Anderson of number 116 Pearl Street, took fire, flames reaching it from the Locust Hill tanks. From this, the flame spread to several of the smaller tanks and threatened for a time to entirely destroy the extensive works. The water mains do not extend out as far as the scene of the conflagration, and the fire apparatus was useless and the firemen helpless, as no water could be had except from the pumps in the yards, and this was cut off by the nearness of the flames. Nothing, therefore, could be done but to let the flames burn themselves out. The fire was virtually out at 6 o'clock last evening, but as it was almost impossible for the owners of the property to get about their yards and ascertain their losses, estimates are vague, and the loss cannot be definitely learned. Donald and Company estimate their loss at about $30,000, and Wilson and Anderson will probably lose about $50,000. To these sums must be added the value of the lighters, canal boats, and other property, which will bring the total loss up to about $100,000. Both oil companies have some insurance, but the amount, as well as the amount of stock on hand, is recorded only at the works, and these records, it is feared, were destroyed. The body of Captain Deary had to be dragged out of the mud by the firemen with a rope. The trunk from the waist up was burned to a crisp, and an arm was burned off at the elbow. The captain leaves a widow and 3 children. He was in the employ of J. Donald and Company. Foreman Keegan of Steamer No. 4 was one of the most efficient firemen in the department and had been in the employ of the city for 10 years.